It's a funny thing, memory. It's not a neat and tidy library of moments, all filed away in chronological order. For me, it's more like an old, overstuffed chest in the attic. Most days, it stays closed. But sometimes, a scent on the breeze or a particular slant of afternoon light will lift the lid just a crack, and a single, vivid picture will float out. Today, it was the photograph. A simple, faded square of paper I keep on my mantelpiece. It's of my daughter, Clara, when she was about 7 years old. She's standing in our old garden in Cedar Creek, Indiana, holding a dandelion she's about to blow. Her eyes are squeezed shut in concentration, her cheeks puffed out, and her little face is the very picture of innocent hope. For the longest time after everything, I couldn't look at it. It hurt too much. It was a picture of a world that no longer existed, a world where dandelions were for making wishes, not for being trampled into the mud. My name is Eleanor, and for 30 years, my world revolved around that little girl in the photograph. I was a single mother, you see. Her father left when Clara was just a toddler, a quiet departure with a note on the kitchen table and a void that took years to fill. But Clara and we made our own world. Our little 2-bedroom house wasn't much, but we filled it with laughter, the smell of baking bread, and the sound of my old record player spinning Motown hits on Saturday mornings. I worked as a librarian, a gentle job that allowed me to be home every day when she got off the school bus. I watched her grow from a chubby-kneed toddler into a gangly, awkward preteen, and then into a young woman with a spirit as bright and untamable as a wildflower. Clara was an artist. Her fingers were always smudged with charcoal or dabbed with paint. She saw beauty where others saw nothing. She'd paint the rust patterns on an old fence, the way the light hit a puddle after a rainstorm, the tired lines on an old woman's face at the grocery store. Her canvases were filled with life, with an empathy that was almost overwhelming. She had my quiet nature, but a heart that was entirely her own, big and open and a little too trusting. That was the part that always worried me. I had built walls around my own heart after her father left, but Clara's had no such defenses. She believed in the inherent goodness of people, a belief I had long since filed away with my own girlhood dreams. When she met Marcus, I understood why. He was everything you'd read about in a romance novel. He was a financial advisor from the city, handsome in that clean-cut, confident way. He had a smile that seemed to reach his eyes and a way of listening to Clara that made her feel like she was the only person in the room. He praised her art, not with the polite encouragement of a stranger, but with a deep, seemingly genuine appreciation. He'd point to a swirl of blue on her canvas and say, "That's it. That's the exact color of the sky right before a storm. How did you capture that?" She blossomed under his attention. The shy, introspective artist began to wear brighter colors, to laugh a little louder. I wanted to love him. For Clara's sake, I truly did. I hosted them for Sunday dinners, listening to Marcus talk about his ambitious career and his plans for their future. He was building a life for her, he said, a life where she would never have to worry about money, a life where she could paint all day without the stress of selling her work. It sounded like a fairy tale. And in fairy tales, there is always a wolf dressed in grandmother's clothing. The first odd note was small, almost too small to notice. We were at a family barbecue, and Clara's cousin mentioned an art fair in a nearby town. "Oh, Clara, you should enter," she'd said. "Your new series would be a huge hit." Before Clara could even respond, Marcus put his arm around her and laughed. "We're far too busy for that," he said smoothly. "Besides, her work is too good to be sold from a tent. It belongs in a proper gallery." It sounded like a compliment, a defense of her talent. But I saw the flicker in Clara's eyes, a tiny dimming of the light. She had loved those little art fairs, the camaraderie with other artists, the joy of selling a piece to someone who genuinely connected with it. But she just smiled and leaned into him, and the moment passed. The moments began to accumulate, like dust motes in a sunbeam, invisible on their own but slowly, surely, clouding the air. He'd critique her clothes. "That dress is lovely, darling, but it doesn't quite say wife of a successful man, does it?" He'd answer her phone for her. "Clara's a bit busy right now. Can I take a message?" he'd say, his voice perfectly pleasant. The calls from her old friends started to dwindle. My own calls with her became shorter, more stilted. There was a new tension in her voice, a carefulness that hadn't been there before. When I'd ask if everything was all right, she'd be quick to reassure me. "Everything's wonderful, Mom. Marcus just takes such good care of me. I'm just tired, that's all." They had been married for 3 years when he convinced her to move 2 hours away to a large, modern house in an affluent suburb. He said it was for his career, a necessary step up. I helped them pack. As I wrapped her old, paint-splattered mugs in newspaper, I felt a cold dread that I couldn't articulate. I was packing away my daughter's life, piece by piece. The new house was beautiful, I suppose. It was all glass and sharp angles, with pristine white walls that seemed to scream for color. But her easel and paints were relegated to a small, windowless room in the basement. A dedicated studio space, Marcus called it. It felt more like a cell. The main living areas were decorated in shades of gray and beige, with abstract corporate art that Marcus had chosen. There was no trace of Clara, no chaotic, beautiful mess that was the hallmark of her existence. The distance was more than just miles. It became an ocean. My weekly visits turned into monthly, then into strained holiday affairs. Marcus was always there, a constant, smiling barrier between us. He'd steer the conversation, interrupt her stories, and answer questions directed at her. I felt like I was visiting a stranger in a showroom, not my daughter in her home. The last time I saw her before that terrible day, her face looked thin, and the light in her eyes I had cherished my whole life was nearly extinguished. She clung to me at the door when I left, a desperate, silent hug that said everything her words could not. "I love you, Mom," she whispered, and it sounded like a cry for help. I drove home with tears blurring the highway lights, my mind screaming that something was profoundly wrong, but my heart not knowing what on earth I could do. I was just her mother on the outside looking in. The helplessness was a physical weight, a stone in my gut. And then, 2 weeks later, the phone call came that shattered the world. It wasn't from Clara or even from Marcus. It was from her next-door neighbor, a woman I'd only met once. Her voice was trembling. "Mrs. Davison? Eleanor? You need to come. You need to get here now." The 2-hour drive to Clara's house felt like a journey across a barren planet. The familiar landscape of Indiana farmland blurred into a meaningless green and brown smear. My hands were fused to the steering wheel, my knuckles white. The neighbor, Brenda, hadn't given me details over the phone, just a frantic urgency that had bypassed my brain and sunk straight into my soul. Every terrible scenario imaginable played on a loop in my head, each one more horrifying than the last. I prayed. I bargained with a God I wasn't even sure I believed in anymore. Just let her be okay. Please, just let my little girl be okay. As I turned onto her street, I knew. Even from 100 yards away, I knew my prayers had not been answered. The street was one of those immaculate suburban lanes where every lawn is manicured to perfection. But Clara's lawn, it was a battlefield of memory. A scene of such profound and personal violation that it took my breath away. Her life, our life, was strewn across the perfect green grass like garbage. Clothes were everywhere. The yellow sundress she wore on her first date with Marcus. The soft, worn-out university sweatshirt I had given her. Her little silk scarves, the ones she used to tie in her hair, now lay limp and dirt-stained, like fallen birds. It wasn't just clothes. It was everything. Books, their pages splayed open and flapping in the slight breeze. And the photographs. Oh, God, the photographs. It was a mosaic of our shared past, desecrated. There was a photo of me holding her as a newborn, her tiny face wrinkled and red. A picture of her on her first bicycle, training wheels and all, with a gap-toothed grin. Her high school graduation photo, her face so full of pride and promise. They were scattered face up, face down, some already curling at the edges from the morning dew. It was a deliberate, surgical removal of her history, of her identity. This wasn't just an angry outburst. This was an execution of a person's soul. My heart, which had been pounding in my chest, seemed to stop altogether. I stumbled out of the car, my legs feeling like they were made of cotton. I walked onto the lawn as if in a trance, my feet treading on memories. I saw a small, clay handprint she had made for me in kindergarten, now cracked in two near the rose bushes. And that's when I saw them. Towards the front of the house, near the pristine, soulless porch. Marcus had her by the upper arm. He wasn't dragging her across the lawn, not in the way you'd drag a sack of potatoes. It was something far more sinister. He was pulling her, yanking her back towards the open front door as she tried to twist away from him. Her body was rigid with a mixture of resistance and terror. She wasn't screaming. Her face was a mask of silent, pleading horror. Her feet were bare. She was wearing a simple nightgown, and her beautiful, long hair was a tangled mess around her shoulders. Her other hand was outstretched, reaching for something on the ground. It was her old sketchbook, the leather-bound one I had bought for her 18th birthday. It lay open, its pages of charcoal figures and delicate landscapes exposed to the sky. His face. I will never forget his face. It was not the charming, handsome face he presented to the world. It was a contorted mask of pure, cold rage. His jaw was clenched, a vein pulsing in his temple. And his eyes were like chips of ice. There was no love there, no remorse. Just a terrifying, possessive fury. "Get back in the house, Clara," he was hissing, his voice low and menacing, the words slicing through the quiet morning air. "Don't you dare make a scene. Make a scene." The absurdity of that statement, standing amidst the wreckage of her entire life scattered across the lawn for all the neighbors to see. It was then that the paralysis broke. A force I didn't know I possessed surged through me. It was the primal, unstoppable power of a mother seeing her child in danger. "Let go of her," I said. My voice didn't sound like my own. It was low, guttural, stripped of all its usual softness. It was the voice of a she-bear. Marcus froze. He turned his head slowly, and for a second, he looked genuinely surprised to see me, as if I were a ghost who had materialized on his perfect lawn. His grip on Clara's arm loosened just a fraction. In that instant, Clara wrenched herself free. She didn't run to me. She scrambled, half-crawling, towards the sketchbook. Her hands shook as she gathered its pages, her shoulders heaving with sobs that were finally breaking free. Marcus took a step towards her, his face darkening again. I said, "Leave it." "Get away from her," I repeated, stepping between them. I am not a large woman. I am a retired librarian who enjoys gardening. But in that moment, I felt 10 feet tall. I stared directly into those cold, empty eyes, and I was not afraid. All the fear had been burned away, replaced by a white-hot certainty. "You will not touch her again." He looked from me to Clara, who was now clutching the sketchbook to her chest like a shield. He saw the neighbor, Brenda, peering from behind her curtains. He saw me unmovable. The mask of the charming man slipped back into place, a chillingly quick transformation. He smoothed his shirt, ran a hand through his hair, and actually managed a tight, false smile. "Eleanor." "There's been a misunderstanding," he said, his voice regaining its practiced smoothness. "Clara's just being a little emotional this morning. We were just doing some spring cleaning." Spring cleaning. The words were so ludicrous, so insulting, that a single, sharp laugh escaped my lips. I looked at the debris field of my daughter's life, then back at him. "You call this spring cleaning?" I gestured to a torn photo of Clara at her prom, her face bright with youthful excitement. "Is this just clutter to you?" He didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on Clara, a look of such venomous ownership that it made my skin crawl. He knew he had lost this round. He had been exposed. Without another word, he turned, walked back into his pristine house, and shut the door. The click of the lock was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I stood there for a long moment, my heart hammering against my ribs, listening to the silence. Then I turned to my daughter. She was still on the ground, huddled over her sketchbook, her body shaking uncontrollably. I knelt down beside her on the damp grass, my knees sinking into the soft earth. I didn't say, "I told you so." I didn't ask what had happened. I didn't say anything at all. I just wrapped my arms around her trembling frame, pulling her close. I held her as she wept, her tears soaking the shoulder of my coat. I held my little girl amidst the ruins of her life, and I whispered the only thing that mattered. I'm here now. I've got you. We're going home. And as I held her, I began the slow, heartbreaking task of gathering the scattered pieces of my daughter's past, one precious, trampled memory at a time. The journey home was a silent one. Clara sat in the passenger seat, wrapped in a blanket I kept in the trunk, clutching that rescued sketchbook to her chest. She stared out the window, but I don't think she saw the passing trees or the endless sky. Her gaze was turned inward, lost in the labyrinth of the past 3 years. I didn't push her to talk. The silence in the car was heavy, but it was a healing silence, a space for the shock to settle. My own mind was a whirlwind of rage, grief, and a profound, aching sorrow for the years my daughter had lost, for the light that had been so cruelly dimmed. Every now and then, I would glance over at her pale profile and the raw, red marks on her arm where his fingers had been. A wave of fury would wash over me, so potent it felt like I could barely breathe. But then I would look at the road ahead, focus on the simple act of driving, of putting miles between her and that house, and the fury would subside into a steely resolve. My only job now was to get her home. Not just to my house, but home to herself. When we arrived back at my little house in Cedar Creek, it was as if the world began to come back into color. The familiar sight of my overgrown rose bushes and the slightly crooked porch swing seemed to represent a safety that was real and tangible. I unlocked the door, and the familiar scent of old books, lemon polish, and me of home greeted us. Clara stood in the entryway for a long moment, just looking around, as if reacquainting herself with a place from a distant dream. She walked over to the mantelpiece and gently touched the frame of the photograph, the one of her as a little girl with the dandelion. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but this one felt different. It wasn't a tear of terror, but one of deep, complicated grief. The first few days were a blur of quiet care. Clara slept. She slept for almost 2 days straight, the kind of deep, exhaustive sleep that only comes after a long battle. I would sit in the chair by her bed, her old childhood bed, and just watch her breathe. I saw the tension slowly leave her face, the knotted muscles in her shoulders begin to relax. When she was awake, she was like a ghost, moving silently through the house, picking things up and putting them down again without purpose. She ate what I put in front of her without comment, and she drank endless cups of the chamomile tea I made her. We didn't talk about Marcus. We didn't talk about the lawn. We just were together. I was rebuilding the nest, feather by feather, hoping the wounded bird I had brought home would one day feel safe enough to sing again. The first crack in her silence came about a week later. I was in the kitchen, sorting through the sad, salvaged pile of photographs I had gathered from the lawn. I was trying to flatten the curled edges, to wipe the dirt from their smiling faces. Clara came in and stood beside me, watching my hands work. She pointed a trembling finger at a picture of her at about 10 years old, covered in mud, holding up a tiny turtle she'd found by the creek. A small, watery smile touched her lips. I remember that day, she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. You made me take my clothes off on the porch before I was allowed inside. I smiled back, my heart aching with love for her. You were a mess, but you were so proud of that turtle. He hated that picture, she said, her voice dropping again. He said it was undignified. He threw it out once, but I found it in the trash and hid it. And just like that, the dam began to break. The story came out, not in a flood, but in fits and starts, over cups of tea late at night and while weeding in the garden. She told me about the isolation, how he'd convinced her that her friends were a bad influence, that her family didn't understand their love. She told me about the constant criticism, disguised as helpful advice. The way he'd belittle her art, calling it a cute hobby, while simultaneously preventing her from pursuing it seriously. He controlled the finances completely, giving her an allowance that barely covered groceries, making her feel like a child. He had chipped away at her confidence, piece by piece, until she no longer trusted her own judgment, her own feelings. She had become a guest in her own life. The final confrontation had started over something trivial. She had found her old portfolio while looking for a misplaced item and had sat on the floor, looking through her old work. He had come in and seen her, and his face had turned cold. He told her she was living in the past, that her old life was meaningless. He started gathering her things, her clothes, her books, her photos, and carrying them outside, telling her that if she was so attached to her pathetic past, she could live in it out on the lawn. It was an act of ultimate humiliation, a public declaration of his power over her. When she had tried to stop him, to save her things, he had grabbed her. That's when the neighbor had called me. Listening to her was the hardest thing I've ever done. Every word was a dagger in my heart, not just for the pain she had endured, but for my own blindness. The signs had all been there, but I hadn't known how to read them. The guilt was a heavy cloak, but I knew that my guilt wouldn't help her. So I just listened. I validated her feelings. I told her that was not your fault. You did nothing to deserve that. I repeated it until I could see a flicker of belief in her exhausted eyes. Healing is not a straight line. There were days she would seem almost like her old self, laughing at a joke or sketching in the garden. And there were days she would retreat into herself, a shadow passing over her, and she would spend the day in bed, the curtains drawn. On those days, I didn't try to cheer her up. I'd just bring her a cup of tea and a book, and sit with her in the quiet darkness, letting her know she wasn't alone. Marcus tried to call at first, dozens of times a day. Then the text started, a barrage of apologies, accusations, and declarations of love. I took her phone and blocked his number. He even drove to the house once, parking down the street. I saw his car from the window, and I called the police. I filed for a restraining order on her behalf. I became her wall, her advocate, her warrior, because she was not yet strong enough to fight for herself. Slowly, painstakingly, Clara began to come back to life. It started with the art. One afternoon, I came home from the grocery store to find she had taken out the easel and paints I had kept stored in the attic. She had set them up in the sunniest corner of the living room. On the canvas was the beginning of a painting. It wasn't of a beautiful landscape or a delicate still life. It was a chaotic swirl of dark, angry colors, blacks, grays, and a violent slash of red. It was raw and painful to look at, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. She was painting her pain. She was taking the ugliness that had been forced upon her and was transforming it into something she could control. Over the next few months, she painted constantly. The canvases were filled with her journey. The dark, chaotic pieces slowly gave way to paintings with glimmers of light. A painting of a single, resilient weed pushing its way through a crack in the pavement. A portrait of her own hands, smudged with paint but strong and capable. And one day, I found her in the garden, painting the old, weathered bird bath. But she wasn't just painting the object. She was painting the light reflecting off the water, the sparrows splashing in it, the moss growing in its cracks. She was seeing the beauty again. The light in her own eyes, the one I thought had been extinguished forever, was beginning to rekindle, soft and tentative at first, but growing stronger each day. It's been a year now. Clara is still with me. She's enrolled in therapy, and she started teaching a small art class for seniors at the community center. She smiles more. She laughs, and it's her real laugh, the one that comes from deep in her belly. We have our rituals. We drink coffee on the porch in the morning. We work in the garden together. Sometimes we just sit in comfortable silence, reading our books. The house is filled with her new paintings, vibrant and full of a strength and depth her earlier work never had. Her pain is part of her story now, a dark thread woven into the rich tapestry of her life, a thread that makes the brighter colors seem even more brilliant. I still look at that photograph on the mantelpiece of the little girl making a wish on a dandelion. But it doesn't hurt anymore. I no longer see it as a picture of a lost world. I see it as a picture of a promise. A promise of hope, of innocence, of a spirit that could be bent but never, ever broken. Her wish didn't come true in the way she might have imagined on that long-ago summer day. Life gave her storms instead of sunshine. But she survived the storm. And I was the harbor that kept her safe until she was ready to set sail again. Being a mother doesn't end when your child grows up. Sometimes that's when it truly begins. And my greatest work of art, my most profound masterpiece, was not anything I created myself, but the love that helped my daughter find her way back to the light and paint her own world back into existence. There are so many different kinds of silence. There's the crisp, peaceful silence of a library just before the doors open for the day, a silence full of promise and stories waiting to be discovered. There's the heavy, expectant silence of a waiting room, thick with unspoken anxieties. And then there was the silence of my house after Clara had grown up and moved out, a lonely quiet I filled with the ticking of the grandfather clock and the hum of the refrigerator. But the silence I've come to know best over this past year is the silence of healing. It's not empty at all. It's a quiet, humming space filled with the things that don't need to be said. It was the sound of my daughter, my Clara, slowly, tentatively, piecing her soul back together. Our days had found a new rhythm, a gentle cadence set by the rising sun and the evening birdsong. Mornings were for coffee on the porch swing, our mugs warming our hands as we watched the world wake up. Afternoons were for the garden, where I would tend my roses and she would sit with her sketchbook, her charcoal-smudged fingers capturing the curl of a petal or the intricate pattern of a spider's web. Her art class for the local seniors had become the highlight of her week. I'd watch her with them, her voice soft and encouraging as she explained how to mix a perfect shade of sky blue or how to find the character in a wrinkled apple. She was giving them the gift of seeing, and in doing so, she was teaching herself to see again, too. The fear hadn't vanished entirely. It was a phantom limb, an ache that would sometimes flare up on a cloudy day or when a car backfired down the street. But it no longer ruled her. She was the mistress of her own house now, this little house, and the quiet spaces within her own heart. I thought we could live in this gentle rhythm forever. I was foolish to believe that the past could be so easily contained. The past has a way of sending in voices. Ours arrived on a Tuesday in a long, stiff envelope with a solicitor's insignia in the corner. It was addressed to Clara. I saw it in the mailbox and my stomach instantly turned to ice. I knew what it was. I carried it into the house holding it by the very edge, as if it were contaminated. Clara was in the living room, a dab of yellow paint on her nose, completely absorbed in the canvas on her easel. She looked so peaceful, so present. My first instinct was to hide it, to burn it, to do anything to keep that look on her face. But I couldn't. This was her battle, and my role had to change from being her shield to being her armor, something that made her stronger, not something that hid her from the world. I placed the envelope on the small table beside her. She didn't look at it at first. She just felt its presence, a cold spot in the warm, sunlit room. The joy drained from her face, replaced by a weary resignation. She slowly wiped her hands on a rag, her movements deliberate, and picked it up. Her fingers trembled as she tore it open. Divorce papers. The words were cold, legal, devoid of all the emotion, pain, and terror they represented. They were a sterile accounting of the end of a nightmare. She read through the pages, her expression unreadable. When she finished, she didn't cry. She didn't rage. She just folded the papers neatly, placed them back in the envelope, and looked at me. "He wants the house sold," she said, her voice flat. "And he's contesting my claim to my studio equipment, calling it a shared marital asset." The audacity of it stole my breath. Her paints, her canvases, her easel, the very tools of her survival, of her soul. He was trying to take even that from her. The white-hot rage I had felt on that lawn a year ago came roaring back. "That monster," I whispered, my hands clenched into fists. "That absolute monster." Clara just nodded, her eyes distant. "I have to get my things, Mom. The rest of my things. Before he sells it all or throws it all away." The thought of her going back there, to that house, was unbearable. "I'll go," I said immediately. "You don't have to. Just make a list, and I'll go with a mover and get everything." She shook her head, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of steel in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I have to do it. I can't let him make me a ghost in my own life anymore. I have to walk in there, and I have to walk out again. On my own terms." I saw the terror warring with determination on her face. And in that moment, my heart swelled with a pride so fierce it almost hurt. My little girl, the one who had huddled, broken on that lawn, was standing up. We arranged it through the lawyers. We were given a 2-hour window on a Saturday when Marcus would be out of the house. The night before, neither of us slept much. I lay in my bed, listening to the house settle, every creak and groan sounding like a footstep. I was a mother again, waiting up for her child to come home safe, but this time, the danger wasn't out in the world. It was in a house just 2 hours away, a house filled with invisible wounds. The drive there was the complete opposite of our last journey on that road. Clara was the one who drove. Her hands were steady on the wheel. She didn't stare blankly out the window. She looked at the road, focused and determined. I was the one who felt like I was going to be sick. When we pulled onto the street, I braced myself. The lawn was, of course, perfect. The brutalized memories had been mown away, fertilized, and replaced with a carpet of unnaturally green grass. It was as if it had never happened. The erasure was almost more violent than the act itself. Clara parked the car, took a deep breath, and turned to me. "Okay," she said, more to herself than to me. "Okay." She had the key the lawyer had provided. As she walked up the pristine pathway, I got out and stood by the car, a silent, watchful sentinel. I saw her hand shake as she put the key in the lock. She paused for a long second, her shoulders squared, and then she pushed the door open and stepped inside. She left the door open for me, an invitation. I followed her in. The house was cold, not just in temperature, but in spirit. It was sterile, silent, and smelled faintly of air freshener. All the neutral, corporate art was still on the walls. It felt like a museum of a life that had never been truly lived. All of Clara's vibrant, chaotic, beautiful paintings were gone. There were no traces of her anywhere in the main living areas. It was as if he had already scrubbed her from the home's memory. We went down to the basement, to the small, windowless room he had called her studio. My heart sank. It was empty. The easel was gone. Her boxes of paints, her rolls of canvas, her jars of brushes, all of it had vanished. He had already taken them. Clara stood in the middle of the empty concrete floor and let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh of disbelief. "He actually did it," she whispered. "He took them." She ran a hand over the wall, where a smear of blue paint still remained, the only evidence she had ever worked here. For a moment, I thought she would crumble. I saw the shadow pass over her eyes, the old fear threatening to pull her under. But then she straightened up. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice shaking but hard. "They're just things. He can't take what's in my head. He can't take my hands." She turned and walked out of the room without a backward glance. We went upstairs to the master bedroom to pack her remaining clothes and personal items. This was harder. These things were more intimate. She opened the closet and her side was half empty, a sad collection of clothes she hadn't worn in years. As she started to put them in boxes, I worked on the nightstand, gathering her books, her reading glasses, a small silver box where she kept trinkets. Inside the drawer, tucked away at the back, I found an envelope. It was one of my old letters to her from a few years ago. I had written to her about my garden, about a funny thing a neighbor had said, just the small, mundane news of my life. On the back of the envelope, in Clara's handwriting, were just 3 words, "Remember who you are." My throat closed up. To see it there, this secret message of hope she had written to herself in the dark, this small act of defiance, it was a testament to the strength she had possessed even when she felt she had none left. I quietly slipped it into my pocket to give to her later. We worked in silence for an hour, a strange, grim parody of Moving Day. We packed away the life she'd had here, taping up the boxes, sealing away the memories. As we were about to leave, Clara stopped in the hallway. She was looking at the wall, where a large, framed photograph of their wedding day had once hung. The nail was still there, but the photo was gone. In its place was a faint, rectangular shadow on the paint. "He took down our wedding photo," she said softly. "Good," I said, with more venom than I intended. "No, it's not that," she said, her brow furrowed. "I took it down months before I left." I couldn't stand looking at his face anymore. I put it in the back of the linen closet. She walked over to the closet, opened it, and rummaged behind a stack of towels. She pulled out the large, ornate frame. They were both smiling in the picture, a perfect, happy couple. A lie captured in silver and glass. Without a word, she carried it downstairs and outside. She leaned it against the curb next to the trash bins. Then she looked back at the house one last time, at its cold, modern facade. She didn't look sad. She looked free. She got in the car and we drove away, leaving the smiling photograph and the empty house behind us for good. That night, after we had unpacked her boxes into the spare room, her old friend Sarah called. It was the first time they had spoken in over 2 years. I heard Clara's hesitant voice from the other room, the long pauses. But then I heard a small laugh. And then another. They were on the phone for over an hour. When she came back into the living room, her eyes were bright, a little red from crying, but shining. Sarah said she missed me, she said, a sense of wonder in her voice, as if she couldn't believe anyone would. She said she knew something was wrong, but she didn't know how to help. She asked if I wanted to meet for coffee next week. Later that evening, I gave her the envelope I had found, with her own handwriting on the back. She stared at the words, "Remember who you are," for a long time. Then she went to her easel. She painted late into the night. The next morning, I came downstairs to find a new canvas drying in the living room. It was a painting of the front of her old house. But it wasn't a dark, angry painting. It was painted in the soft, hazy light of early morning. On the perfect green lawn, there were no clothes or photos. Instead, there were thousands and thousands of dandelions, their white, fluffy heads ready to be carried away by the wind. And walking away from the house, her back to it, was the small figure of a woman, her head held high, stepping onto a path that led away into a landscape bursting with color and light. The divorce was finalized a few months later. The house was sold. The legal fight over her art supplies was eventually dropped. These were just logistical details, the epilogue to a story that was already over. The real victory had already been won, not in a courtroom, but in a quiet living room, with a smear of blue paint on a wall, a phone call from a friend, and a canvas covered in dandelions, waiting for the wind to set them free. The human heart is a bit like a garden. For a long time, my daughter's heart had been a place of scorched earth, a landscape of ruin where nothing could grow. My love was the rain, and my home was the good soil, but I knew that I couldn't make the seeds sprout. All I could do was provide the right conditions and wait, with a gardener's patient hope, for the first green shoots of life to push their way back toward the sun. The first real shoot was her reconnecting with her old friend, Sarah. Their coffee date was planned for a Thursday, and the morning of, our little house was buzzing with a nervous energy we hadn't felt in a year. Clara tried on 3 different outfits, something I hadn't seen her do since she was a teenager getting ready for a dance. She'd hold a sweater up to herself, frown in the mirror, and toss it onto the bed. It wasn't about vanity, it was about presentation. Who was she now? Was she the broken woman who had fled a monstrous marriage? Was she the quiet artist hiding in her mother's house? Or could she, just for an hour, be Clara again? Just Clara, who loved bad puns and knew all the lyrics to 60s folk songs. She finally settled on a simple blue dress and the string of pearls I had given her for her 30th birthday, a birthday spent under Marcus's chilling surveillance. Seeing her wear them now felt like a quiet reclamation. I watched her leave from the kitchen window, my heart doing a little flutter kick of anxiety and hope. I busied myself for the next 2 hours, deadheading roses with a ferocity they didn't deserve and scrubbing a perfectly clean countertop. It was my own ritual of worry. When I saw her car pull back into the driveway, I held my breath. She walked in, and the first thing I saw was her smile. It wasn't the small, tentative smile I had grown used to. This was a full, genuine smile that reached her eyes and made them shine. It was, she started, then stopped, searching for the word. It was normal. We talked about her kids and her new job, and we complained about the terrible music they were playing in the coffee shop. It was so wonderfully, beautifully normal. She sat down at the kitchen table, her whole body seeming to relax. She told me she was angry with herself for not reaching out sooner. She said she felt him pushing her away, but she didn't know what to do. She thought I was happy. It wasn't her fault, honey, I said softly. I know, Clara replied, and I knew she truly did. The blame, which she had carried for so long, was finally beginning to slide from her shoulders. She's helping organize a local art fair at the end of the summer. A proper one in the old town hall. She thinks I should get a booth. There it was. A door, opening back into the world she had loved. The world of camaraderie, of shared passion, of putting her work, her soul, out there to be seen. I saw the familiar flicker of fear in her eyes, the old shadow. Oh, I don't know, she began. It's been so long. My work is different now. Different is good, I said, sitting down opposite her. Different is honest. Your work has never been more honest, Clara. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. Think about it. No pressure. Just think about it. She did more than think about it. For the next 2 months, our house was transformed. It became a factory of creation. The living room was her permanent studio now, smelling of turpentine and linseed oil. Canvases, big and small, were stacked against every wall. She painted with a feverish intensity one had never seen before. She painted the seniors in her art class, capturing the wisdom and humor in their wrinkled faces. She painted the changing light on the creek behind my house. She painted bowls of fruit from the farmer's market, but she painted them with such life and vibrancy they seemed to hum with energy. She was not just painting what she saw, she was painting what she felt. She was painting her way back to joy. About a week before the fair, she brought the dandelion lawn painting out from the spare room. She had not touched it since the day she'd finished it. She set it on her easel and just stood there, looking at it for a long time. It was a beautiful, haunting piece. It was a painting of hope, but a hope born from deep sorrow. Should I show this one? She asked me, her voice barely a whisper. Is it too much? I looked at the canvas, at the figure of the woman walking away from the cold, sterile house and into a world of impossible, hopeful color. It's the truest one of all, I told her. It's your story, and you don't have to be ashamed of your story. She nodded, a silent agreement, and began to carefully wrap it for the show. The day of the art fair was bright and warm, a perfect late summer Saturday. The old town hall was bustling with people, the air filled with chatter and the sound of a lone guitarist playing softly in the corner. Clara's booth was near a large, arched window. She had arranged her paintings beautifully. They were a testament to her journey, a vibrant, colorful narrative of a soul's return. I stood back, trying to be an invisible presence, just a proud mother watching from the wings. At first, she was nervous. She stood stiffly beside her display, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. But then people started to stop. They didn't just glance, they looked. An elderly gentleman stood for 10 minutes in front of her portrait of his friend from the art class, a tear glistening in his eye. A young couple cooed over a small painting of 2 sparrows splashing in my bird bath. With each person who stopped, with each quiet compliment, I saw Clara's shoulders relax. I saw her start to talk to people, to explain her technique, to share a small story about a painting. She was not just selling art, she was connecting with people. She was stepping back into the flow of the world. The dandelion lawn painting was at the center of her display. It drew a lot of attention. People would stand before it, their heads tilted, their expressions thoughtful. They didn't know the story, of course. They just saw a powerful image of departure and hope. Late in the afternoon, a woman about my age, with kind eyes and a gentle face, approached Clara. She had been looking at the dandelion painting for some time. This one, the woman said, her voice soft. It feels important. It is, Clara replied simply. It's about leaving a place you thought was home, and finding out that home is actually somewhere else entirely. The woman nodded, a look of deep understanding on her face. I know that feeling, she said. I'm redecorating my study. It's my own space, for the first time in a very long time. I would be honored to have this on my wall, to remind me that new things can grow, even in the most unexpected places. She bought the painting. I watched as Clara carefully wrapped it for her, my eyes blurring with tears. It wasn't about the money. It was about the fact that her story, her pain, transformed into art, had spoken to someone else's soul. It had been seen and understood and valued. Her past had not been erased, it had been redeemed. On the drive home, the car was full of a new kind of silence. A tired, happy, peaceful silence. We had sold several paintings, but more than that, Clara had spent an entire day being herself, wholly and unapologetically. We heard through Sarah a few weeks later that Marcus had sold the house and moved to another state. He had apparently remarried quickly to a much younger woman. When Sarah told her this, Clara was quiet for a moment. I watched her face, searching for any sign of pain or anger. But there was none. She just looked thoughtful. "I hope he doesn't break her," she said softly. And that was it. There was no rage, no bitterness. Only a quiet, distant pity. He was a chapter in a book she had already finished reading. It's been 5 years now since that terrible morning on the lawn. Clara has her own small apartment now, just a few blocks away from me. It's a cheerful, chaotic place, filled with books and plants and the constant, wonderful mess of her art. She never stops painting. She teaches, she sells her work at fairs, and her life is full. It's not a fairy tale life, but it's a real one. It has its struggles and its worries, but it is hers. She built it herself, with her own 2 hands. I am sitting on my porch swing now, a cup of tea growing cold beside me. The evening is settling in, painting the sky in shades of rose and lavender. In a few minutes, Clara will be here. She comes for dinner every Sunday. We'll talk about our week, we'll laugh, and we'll sit in the comfortable silence that is the bedrock of our relationship. Inside, on my mantelpiece, the old photograph of a 7-year-old Clara is still there. But it's not alone anymore. Next to it stands a newer photo, taken last year. It's of the 2 of us, our arms around each other, standing in front of her display at an art fair. We are both smiling. Memory, as I said, is a funny thing. It's not just an old chest in the attic. It's also a garden. For a long time, there was a patch of dark, ruined earth in the garden of my memory, a place I was afraid to look at. But over time, with love and with courage, new things have grown there. Not to cover the scar, but to grow out of it, to make it part of a new, more resilient landscape. I look at the 2 photographs, the little girl with a dandelion wish and the strong woman who learned to plant her own garden. And I understand now that a mother's love isn't just about protecting your child from the storms. It's about teaching them how to dance in the rain and holding the umbrella until they are strong enough to hold it for themselves. And sometimes it's simply about being the sun and the soil and having faith that one day, no matter how harsh the winter, they will find their own way to bloom.